Welcome, everyone. I'm Carol Becker, Dean of Columbia University School of the Arts, and thank you for joining us tonight for the conversation on experimental approaches to historic preservation, featuring the artists Jorge Otero-Pailos and Sam van Aken. And tonight's event is part of our public program series organized around the theme of repair. But before I introduce our guests, I want to acknowledge that Manhattan is part of the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Lenni Lenape and Wappinger people. And by acknowledging the legacies of violence and displacement, migration, and settlement that have enabled us to gather here tonight, we are taking a very small step towards the long and much overdue process of repair. And through ongoing education and responsible representation, the School of the Arts is committed to addressing these issues embedded in the history of this country, but also in that of our own community. I want to thank Gavin Browning, Director of Public Programs and Engagement, our communications team, Christina Rumpf, Chrissy Tate, Tiffany Davis, and Carrie McHugh, and of course, Jesse Cotter, who is running this webinar for us tonight. And also, I want to thank Shane Brennan, Director of Public Programs at the Trust for Governors Island, who is also one of our partners for this event tonight. In our repair series, we are exploring creative practices that engage social and political initiatives committed to reimagining and transforming the frayed relationships between humans and the social structures we have created, as well as those between humans and other species, humans and the planet, and those conflicted relationships within ourselves, which often are in need of some form of repair. And all of this is contextualized within the concept that art creates space to examine and to help transform our understanding of the world. When we first imagined this theme, we did not as yet know about the pandemic, but we did know about the state of the country and the complexity of what we have been living for the past 4 years. We knew that the election would be perhaps the most important event in our country's recent life, and that even with the best outcome, hoping for the best outcome, the country would still be in great need of repair. So let me introduce our guests, both of whom are working with issues of embedded history, preservation, conservation, and healing, but in completely unique ways. And I have found the work of each of these artists original and engaging, and I wanted to bring them together. I wanted them to meet, actually, to talk about their ephemeral, historical, mnemonic approaches to art making and preservation as they cross multiple disciplines and invent new ones along the way. So Sam van Aken is an artist who works beyond various traditional modes of art making to develop important perspectives on such themes as communication, botany, agriculture, climatology, and the ever-increasing impact of technology. And I first met Sam when he brought this enormous tree to Davos, and he was sitting near this tree, grafting branches onto each other. And of course, in that context, I had to go over and say, what is this about? This is so amazing. His intervention in the natural and public realms are as practical as they are metaphoric. They serve as the source of narrative, sites of placemaking, and in some cases, have even become the basis of scientific research. His work is represented by Ronald Feldman, Fine Arts. He's an associate professor in the School of Art in Syracuse University, and his project, The Open Orchard, which he's going to be speaking about tonight, was commissioned by the Trust for Governors Island, and amazingly will be planted on that island in 2021, something really great to look forward to. Jorge Otero-Pailos is our colleague at Columbia, but I first met him at the 53rd Venice Biennale, where he had an incredibly beautiful cast imprint embodying the dust and pollution of one of the remaining uncleaned walls of the Doge's Palace, I now know. And he is best known for making monumental casts of historically charged buildings. Drawing on his very formal training in architecture and preservation, his art practice deals with memory and culture and transitions, and many of his artworks are made by preserving parts of monuments that are deemed insignificant by others, such as dust, pollution, sound, or scent. He is director and professor of historic preservation at the Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and his latest project, Watershed Moment, is on display at Lyndhurst Estate in Tarrytown, New York, right now through Sunday, November 1st. So Jorge will present first, followed by Sam, and then we're going to engage in a conversation joined by Gavin Browning, Director of Public Programs, who has a background in urban studies. Gavin has edited and produced the multimedia project Housing Works History, and he's editor of the books Group Efforts, Changing Public Space, and the Studio X New York Guide. So please ask questions of these fantastic, really interesting artists, preservationists, and leave them for Jorge and Sam in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we will try to incorporate them in the conversation. So let's begin with Jorge.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you for that generous introduction. It's a real pleasure to be with you. It is such an opportunity to be in the company of Sam and you, and to be able to share my thoughts on my work, but also to learn so much from Sam's work, which I find very inspiring and admire, and we can talk more about that in a second. Let me start by sharing my screen and showing you this project, which Carol mentioned briefly, about Watershed Moment. This is a watershed. It's a shed that contains water. It's one of the earliest pools in America. It was built in 1911 on the shores of the Hudson River, just 18 miles north of Manhattan, at the extravagant cost of $60,000 at the time, the equivalent of $1.6 million today in 2020. The water was heated by burning coal, and during World War II, the coal was rationed, so it was not possible to heat it, and the owners closed it up and abandoned it. Soon leaks developed, small ones, then big ones, then the roof collapsed. In a couple decades, it was a ruin. In 1961, its last owner, Anna Gould, donated and the large estate on which it sits, the state of Lyndhurst, to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The trust stabilized the ruin with some emergency repairs, and you can see some of them here on the front portico. Some of that scaffolding is part of it. Very little, apart from the walls, the masonry walls, was left. All the plaster, interior plaster, was damaged, all the wood. And the trust closed it to the public because it was unsafe to visit. So about 3 years ago, the trust invited me to create a site-specific work on one of their properties, and I proposed to create a moment for the public to enter this ruin. So therefore, the title of the piece is simply Watershed Moment. But of course, we are all living through a watershed moment as well, in which we don't know which way our culture is going. And I was very interested in the ability for us to inhabit that metaphor of the watershed moment by encountering this ruin. So to create a moment in a ruin, and this ruin compelled me to examine how other artists had probed the relationship of ruins to time. Because this is a ruin on the Hudson River, I entered into a dialogue with the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting, and in particular with Thomas Cole. And here you have a detail of his The Course of Empire, Desolation painting of 1836, which I brought as my kind of memory bank as I entered into this ruin for the first time myself. For Cole, ruins in landscapes were metaphors of multiple timescales, the simultaneous experience of short human timescales and long geologic timescales. Cole's paintings, at least for me, explore the polytemporal nature of lived experience. We experience the present as a long moment, overlapping with our own memories and our anticipations of the future. Cole's paintings captured long and short spans of time through analogies to space. In those paintings, you have small human figures set in vast geographies. And following Cole, I became interested in creating an artwork that could express, to bring together these multiple timescales and multiple spatial scales within one aesthetic experience. So the first scale is the scale, the building, this image over here is where visitors first encounter my artwork. And this is the entrance lobby. The front door is to the left, and the door in front of us is the door to one of the two changing rooms, one for male bodies and one for female bodies, one to the right, one to the left. So I suspect that most visitors, when they come in here, they don't recognize this as my artwork, but in fact, I see it very much as my artwork. I directed how to repair this space so that it would continue to appear as a ruin. So for example, when I first got here, there was no floor. And I wanted the new floor. We had to put a floor so people could come in. I wanted it to be untreated plywood. I didn't want any paint. I didn't want any finished floors. I gave instructions not to paint the walls, not to repair the walls, not to put in a new ceiling. I didn't want any signage or interpretation text telling people that this is the artwork and this is not the artwork. I wanted visitors to draw that line in their own mind, to walk in and ask themselves, where does this artwork begin? Is this the artwork? Am I in it now? I also didn't want text narrating the story of the building. I wanted people to encounter this building and to wonder about its story, but to have their personal histories take center stage here, to create an opportunity for people to plunge into their own memories as measures of time and to use their own bodies first and foremost as measures of space. So I didn't want to add any text, but I also didn't want to remove any text that was there. And in fact, there was a little bit of text tucked away in the trim of one of the doors. And I found an old photograph there of the pool, a cutting from one of the National Trust's publications from the 1970s that they must have put there, somebody, nobody knows, probably to entice someone to help pay for the restoration of this building. I made sure to try to save this, and some visitors miss it and others see it with the tape that's falling off the wall. So there's the image. Here's the pool. The pool is filled in this image. You can see the owners enjoying the water, but the pool is now empty. Different elements of the space that you see there today register the fact that there was water here. For example, if you look inside the pool, you see there is a mark left by the pool when it was when it was stained, and you can see the casts. These are casts that I made with latex, casts of the surrounding walls, and you can see on those latex casts the registration of the water of the water stains left behind as the water entered the building. So these are little cascades of water that dripped over the walls slowly and dissolved their surfaces and washed into dusts and washed those dusts off onto the wall. And so when I paint liquid latex onto the walls, the latex dries and absorbs all those dusts. But some of those dusts were also dusts that came from the coal, the burning of coal in the back of the pool, which you can see here, this lean-to addition. This is where all the machinery was. This is the chimney where all the coal came out. So you had dust and soot on it, even though it's a very idyllic space. So the casts help supplement the space, making more visible the multiple scales of time within the space. You can walk between the casts and the existing walls where they came from in the corridors here to the left. Now alone, the casts don't register the multiplicity of spatial scales, especially the multiplicity of spatial scales through which water extends, from the small droplets to being inside our bodies, to water bodies like lakes and rivers, to vast geographies of watersheds. So I found myself tracing water, and you can see here at the bottom of the screen, this is This is the site plan. This is over here where the pool is. This is the Lyndhurst mansion. It's sitting right on the Hudson River, but underneath it goes the Croton Aqueduct, which was built in the 1840s to fight the cholera pandemic in New York City. So I went inside the aqueduct and started recording the sound of water. And here's how the piece sounds. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to reshare my screen so you can actually hear it. And forgive me for that, but give me just a second and I will make sure to do that because I forgot to do that at the beginning. And it is my fault. Excuse me. So, and now I am trying to, just a second here. Now I somehow cannot share my screen. I might need Jesse's help to do it because I don't have the, oh, sorry. Here we go. Now I can share my screen again. Apologies. So 1 second, and sorry for the inconvenience, but you will thank me later for the sound quality. And here we go. So here is the, I have to share that again, I believe. So I find myself going up the Hudson River and up the Croton Aqueduct and following the Croton Aqueduct to its as I followed the water bodies of New York State, I found myself on the heels of Thomas Cole, who himself was on the heels of the Erie Canal, which had just opened up, and also on the heels of surveyors that were surveying all of New York State to put in the competition to the Erie Canal, which was to be the Erie Railroad. So when you see the image here of the casts, you're really seeing that way, hearing all those water bodies as a collage of sound as we move out from the building itself, the sound of water in the building, finger lake, all the way to now. What's interesting is that as the surveyors were surveying New York State is exactly the time when this property, Lyndhurst, was being designed by Alexander Jackson Davis. And of course, this was the time when Thomas Cole was doing his paintings. And this is the way that Thomas Cole had imagined that his Course of Empire paintings would be exhibited. They were 5, and they went, of course, as everyone knows, from the pastoral state at the bottom left-hand side all the way to Arcadia, the consummation of empire, then destruction and desolation. What is interesting for me in these paintings are the way they represent multiple temporal and spatial scales together. Water is an allegory of geological time here. You always see the same geological feature, this prominent mountain feature, but then the water going in front of it. That river is the river of time, of course. But then if you notice throughout these different paintings, the sun is moving from left to right. It is the the time of one day. So everything is represented in one day. The human figures are the time of human time, the human lifespan. But then architecture figures in here as the time of civilization, the length of a civilization's rise and fall. And so I was thinking very much about this piece. And as you can see, I cut out 5 holes because there are 5 windows. And in a way, I see these as the kind of, homage to those 5 paintings that in my mind are filling in those holes, those windows through which you see the outside and the Hudson River. Now, of course, the course of empire acquired a completely different idea with by the after Civil War. And here you have a painting by Fanny Palmer, very famous across the continent westward. The course of empire takes its way, where the locomotive is now creating, the course of empire, and it's replacing architecture. And of course, all the pollution that's coming off of it is actually going to the wrong side of the tracks to pollute the Native American Indians. I don't think that is by mistake, that she actually put the smoke on moving in that direction as the settlers begin to take the land. So as I thought about this work and I moved across New York State, I of course thought about the fact that 20 years later, the same person that purchased this land, this estate, this place where this pool is sitting, also purchased the Erie Canal Railroad. And in a way, this site is dependent on that hinterland, because the wealth that was extracted from that hinterland is what allowed him to pay for this property and this site, which was to be a retreat for him. Jay Gould contracted tuberculosis, and he moved out of the city to this estate to try to regain his health. So all these questions about bodies, about health, about our relationship to the environment, about our relationship to water, about these multiple timescales, these multiple spatial scales, are the ideas that I was trying to play with in order to give this, create this artwork that both contains and expands our perception, that allows us to experience multiple timescales and multiple geological spatial scales, and to think about bodies in relationship to the environment. Our body is the only body in this space. This is meant to be experienced alone. It's the only water body in this space. There is no water inside the watershed except the bodies of people that move in there. There is the sound of those immense water bodies that resonate within the walls, and that resonate within the bodies of the people in there. And then together with that is the dust of the pollution that was generated at the site, but also all around America at this time and around the world with industrialization. So I wanted to capture that as well, that water comes to the site as in relationship to that new pollution. So I will stop here and hand over the screen and the mic to Sam.
Great, thank you, Jorge. That was amazing, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. Okay, let's see. Okay, yeah, I started the Tree of 40 Fruit Project. Really, it was an artistic conceit. I was interested in the idea of transubstantiation, and it's where the appearance of the thing remains the same, but its reality changes. And so the idea was to have this normal looking tree, or somewhat normal looking tree, throughout the majority of the year until spring, when it blossomed in all of these different colors, and then in summer bore over 40 different types of fruit. And the trees are created through the process of grafting. I'll go out, I'll collect branches during the winter, and I'll refrigerate them or hold them until spring when the tree breaks dormancy. And then I can they call it top working, or cut and insert the branches onto the ends of the tree. And almost all fruit trees are propagated. And the reason for that is that most fruits are genetically unstable, in particular apples. So if you took 100 pieces of fruit from the same apple tree, took their seeds, planted them, you would get 100 different trees. And it means that in order to preserve varieties, we need to propagate them clonally. We need to graft them. And it's led me to think that these fruit are actually as much cultural as they are natural. And I learned about grafting from my great grandfather. I had never met him, but everybody in the farming community where I grew up who spoke about him, they sort of talked about him as if he was some sort of mystic for being able to possess this capability. So when I started the project, I had difficulty finding 40 different types of fruit. And this is despite the fact that 100 years ago, New York State was the second leading producer of fruit in the country. And it was at this point I was introduced to the extent to which we've created monocultures throughout the country. What we've done is we've narrowed the number of varieties of each fruit, of each vegetable, down to, in some cases, just to a handful of varieties. And so as I would find different varieties through, traveling throughout the state, what I would do is I would bring them back to my nursery and I would graft them on to my nursery trees. And I realized what I could do is take an entire orchard and collapse it onto a single tree. And so I'll grow the tree of 40 fruit for 3 to 5 years in my nursery. And this is what they'll look like during planting. And then this is what they look like, 6 to 7 years later. And so these are some of the details of the blossoming. And so each of the trees has a different diagram to it. And there I map the year in which I grow the trees. So each of the varieties I work with has a slightly different form and a slightly different color to the blossom. And in the process of creating these, I realized what I could do is essentially design how the tree blossoms in spring. What colors are going to emerge first. And it also extends the blossoming time, which would ordinarily be like 10 to 14 days to about a 3-week period. And so these are what the fruit look like during the middle of summer. The trees will produce fruit from July through October, which I found is actually pretty nice to have in your backyard because it gives you the perfect amount of fruit, whereas some of my other trees are just single variety trees and I'm always pawning fruit off on my friends. The number 40 is very specific. It's found throughout Western religion as a number that is not a dozen, not the infinite, but a multitude or a bounty. And so as I was asked to create these trees in different locations throughout the country, what I started to do is I would research varieties that were historically grown in the area where the tree was to be placed. I'd source them from local farmers and I would graft them onto the tree so that it becomes an agricultural history of the region. And I was thinking of it in terms of making this kind of index to this archive that is rapidly disappearing. And so this is an image of the latest planting that was at Pioneer Works just about 3 weeks ago. And this is an apple tree that has 40 different varieties, and they're all varieties that originated or were historically grown in New York. And the thing that's interesting about this is that we borrowed a technique of planting from Rudolf Steiner, which involves packing cow manure into these cow horns and burying them next to the tree. And I think through the project, through the Tree of 40 Fruit, I've started to look at these past ways of growing, to look at a different time, different techniques, because we're so immersed in industrialized agriculture. So every once in a while, the Tree of 40 Fruit makes the rounds on the internet. About 3 weeks ago, my students started emailing me and texting me because I showed up on Kanye West's Twitter feed, which I was absolutely petrified by. But my students thought I don't think I need to show up the rest of the semester to teach. It was obviously very important, but the first time uh, that it was the tree started to show up online, I was invited by NPR to show up on Weekend Edition, which, it's like for college professors, I think that's kind of like the holy grail. Um, but the one thing I didn't think about on talking on NPR is that everybody in the government listens to NPR. And I was contacted the following Monday by the USDA and the Department of Defense. And I found out through, I spoke with people at DARPA, and I found out that food security exists as a national security threat, right? It's like one of the highest ranking national security threats. And the reason is that with a limited number of varieties of each type of food or each type of vegetable, if a disease were to happen to one of them, it runs the risk of wiping out an entire portion of the food supply. And it sort of really shifted the focus of the work. And in that process, also I found out that I had one of the largest collections of stone fruit, in particular, in the eastern part of the country, which was absolutely terrifying for me, because this was an art project. And I think it was this, I started to go in and look at each of the varieties individually. And I started to see this origin and this history that was unknown. So what I did is I set out to not only preserve each of the fruit varieties by keeping them growing, but somehow try to preserve the culture, the history behind them. So I would go into orchards as they were being cut out, preserve the bowl section, which is the trunk section, including the graft. Um, as you can see here, I started creating my own herbarium specimens, so that even if I lost that actual piece of that variety of fruit, there would be some DNA evidence. Those eventually became voucher specimens, which are scientific specimens you would find in an herbarium. I started creating cyanotypes, which was an early way of documenting fruit varieties. Built a printing studio in my basement and started making copper plate engravings and letterpress descriptions for each of these fruit. And sort of following these 19th century methods, and then ultimately starting to carry out some of the folklore that surrounds these fruit varieties. So in China, there was a ritual where you would collect peach branches during an eclipse and you would soak them in salt water till the next new moon. You hang them by a red string and they become magic wands that you hang over the door for good luck at New Year. And there's a book by Susan Dolan that was written for the National Park Service that looked at historical orchards. And in it, she talks about the 19th century as, and this is going to sound really nerdy even for me, the Golden Age of Pomology. So the Golden Age for the study of fruit. And she talked about how there's a particular fashion and a discourse. People were trying to breed new varieties, and also this aspect of mysticism to the fruit. And I think that, for me, it's like trying to find, that cultural part of it. But ultimately, I realized that, trying to preserve these stories, I needed a place to share all of this. And so I set out to create a public orchard. And I shopped the project around for like 3 or 4 years, and I wanted to place it as close as I could to New York City. I was trying to leverage everybody I knew, and I wasn't really having much luck until I was asked to propose the project at Governor's Island. And so Governor's Island is a decommissioned naval and Coast Guard base that was given to the city of New York in 2000. And it opened up 178 acres, just a 5-minute ferry ride from the southern tip of Manhattan. And yeah, I'm pleased to say that yeah, they sort of are going with me on this journey, and we're going to be planting what we're calling the open orchard. And so the open orchard will be 50 multi-grafted trees. Each tree will have about 4 varieties, and it will preserve 200 varieties that originated or were historically grown in New York City. And New York City can arguably, it can be arguably be described as, the home of fruit growing in the United States. The Lenape would cultivate native plum varieties, including beach plums, along the coast. When the Dutch came, they brought cherry seeds with them, and the Lenape cultivated cherry orchards up and down the Hudson River. The first Dutch governor of Manhattan brought pear trees with him and planted this tree known as the Stuyvesant pear at the corner of 13th Street and 3rd Avenue in 1650, and it survived until 1850. The Newton Pippen apple, this was the first global apple, originated in Flushing, Queens, and it became the apple of kings and queens. It was the first variety that kings and queens would pay to have barrels of it shipped back to Europe because the taste was so good. There's the Washington Gage. There was a tree that existed in the Bowery that was struck by lightning. It sprouted new growth and became this different variety of plum that's still known. And there's the George IV peach, which somebody was walking on South Street, right by where the Governor's Island Ferry is now, through a peach pit between 2 buildings. It grows, someone tastes the fruit, decides it's magnificent, and then it also becomes grown around the world. And so the aim is to bring all of these varieties to Governor's Island and make it open to the public. And so I'm thinking of the open orchard in many ways like the tree of 40 fruit. It's experiential, it's symbolic, but I think a big change in it is that it also becomes a place for sharing. So right now we have hundreds of trees growing on Governor's Island, and the ones that aren't planted on site, we are working to place in community orchards throughout the city, and so that we're actually returning varieties to community gardens near where they originated. In addition to that, we're also having workshops through Green Thumb on how to plant these trees, how to grow them, prune them, and care for them. Eventually, we'll be having fresh eating tours, so touring the orchard, being able to pick the fruit, learning about their history. And then also very much hoping that it's going to be, we can partner with local chefs to recreate centuries-old dishes that were designed specifically for these fruit. So I've been working on my horrible home cooking shows, and so this is plum clafoutis. These are a specific type of European plum. They're rolled in sugar, and you pour almost like a pancake batter over the top of it, cook it in a cast iron skillet and something like this. I've also been collecting recipes from around the world. So this is a recipe for plum chutney that I got from one of my students' mothers in India. Eventually, it'll also exist as a series of publications, including a field guide that lists all of the varieties, their origin, and dates on it. And my hope, through these, by making these trees available, I also want to open source the entire Tree of 40 Fruit project to make it so that everybody, at least knows how to create them. One of the things in sort of the early 20th century, they started to make this distinction between commercial fruit growers who would narrow and grow only a few varieties, and amateur growers who were these people that were into these unique and rare fruit varieties. And it was because of these people, because of these amateur growers, they preserved much of the biodiversity of fruit that we now have. Just to give you an idea, 100 years ago, there were 2,000 varieties of peaches, nearly 2,000 varieties of plums, and only a fraction of those still exist. There were 800 name varieties of apples, and what little we do have, we owe to those amateur growers. And in looking at this idea of amateurism, every year with these trees, I've been doing them about 10 years, and I've learned quite a bit, but every year I'm reminded of how much I don't know. And I'm always thinking of myself as an amateur, and I don't think that's a bad thing, because the root of amateur is amor. And as we continue to industrialize and we continue to commercialize our food and just about everything else, it's nice to do something out of love, and because you love doing it. So thank you. And I believe it's time now for the discussion.
Hi, everybody. It was so amazing listening to both of you. And because I've said it to you, one of my whole purposes here was for you two to meet. So I would like to start by giving you a chance to talk to each other. And as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking I'm going to sort of knight you as the caretakers of the ephemeral. Like you're like both of you are engaged in such such interesting projects. And the last thing that you said, Sam, about love and passion. I mean, you're both like so passionate about what you do. And Jorge, you create, these magical fabrics out of dust that look like gold cloth when the light is shining through them. And you create this biblical tree of 40 fruit. I mean, both so incredible. So let me give you a chance to just ask or say anything you'd like to each other. Since if we were all together in the physical, we would be having dinner, but we're not.
Yeah.
So we're having dinner with all of the people watching tonight.
I just thank you, Sam. That was a great talk. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about this notion of the archival dimension of the tree, which is, on the one hand, the tree itself is an archive, but you've created this whole kind of parallel archive of each tree. And so I was wondering whether you conceive of the archive as or you conceive of the tree as this extended archive. I mean, the tree itself is also its archive, or what is the tree for you?
Yeah, I kind of stumble on that a lot too, and it gets confusing for me in terms of, like, I'd like to conceive of it as this idea of, it's an index to this archive that was, right, or in terms of this sort of diversity of fruit that were once grown in a place. But in many ways, it really is the archive, in that it's the only extant varieties that are remaining of the fruit in that area. So yeah, it's I kind of trip up on that quite a bit. And I'm interested in this idea. Like, I love the metaphorical layers throughout it, and I keep coming back to dust as this residue, and at least the way that I'm looking at it is, it's like a residue of presence, right, in terms of like the people that inhabit it, but also environmental, and also even towards climate change. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit in terms of how else you see the dust functioning.
Yeah, I mean, the dust. I mean, this work is a real shift for me, in the sense that it comes from an investigation that has lasted about a decade now, called The Ethics of Dust, and in which I've casted monuments around the world and remove their pollution. And one of the first ones was the one that Carol saw in Venice, which was the last remaining piece of dust on this building, which, because of the belief that to repair a building is to clean it and to wash it, what was happening was that, and it's happening all around the world, is we're removing all of this layer of dust, which is actually an archive of the world's atmosphere.
Yeah.
And so I kind of set upon to collect, a bit like you collecting fruit. I've been trying to collect the atmosphere in different places, because it's surprising. We actually don't really have a lot of material evidence of what the atmosphere has been like. We, started collecting, systematic data really around the world less than 100 years ago. I mean, really let's say 150 years ago, you really start getting some systematic data in some areas of the world, but worldwide. And you're looking at people taking measurements, and what they record is the measurement. They don't actually save the dust.
Yeah.
So the only archive was these monuments around the world. And so that's why I started collecting them. So there is, and at first I thought I was cleaning the monuments, then I realized I was collecting the atmosphere.
Wow. It's beautiful, because I'm also thinking that, I mean, it very much functions like memory, right? It settles, right? And it's not really thought about until it's kicked up, right? And reanimated. So it's really beautiful in those terms.
But you're both talking about like the effects of industrialization in various ways. I mean, that's the thing that came through for me in listening to both of you tonight. What happened to the air that used to not be full of coal and all of these pollutants? And what happened to all that fruit? Like, where did all those varieties go? Like, what is, how did that happen? And why did that happen? Why did people allow that to happen? I guess that's a question,
Well, with the,
is it sort of a record of our consumption patterns too, like what the changing tastes in fruit and what is transportable and what's commodifiable, and also with the residue in the buildings of modes of transportation and tying back to industrialization.
Yeah, and it really is with fruit. What happened was, so they encouraged fruit growers to focus just on a handful of varieties because they're easier to manage, right? So, and there's an interesting story with universities. So each state has a land grant university that used to be a place that would make available all these different types of fruit and vegetables for farmers to be able to grow. And so coming through those land grant universities, they encourage people to focus on fewer and fewer varieties because it's easier to manage. But then also through decreased funding to those universities, they could offer less and less resources to local farmers. And then eventually we just became dependent on fossil fuels to ship foods across country. So now 40% of all of the produce that we get in New York comes from California. And so, but I think, Gavin, you're also right in terms of how they've bred modern fruit is that they've, over the past 100 years, they've gradually taken out the nutritional value to increase the sugar content to make fruit almost like candy. So when you go to get something, it doesn't have a complex taste. You bite into it and it's just like, it's a blast of sugar. So I can talk about it all day.
In terms of, I mean, it's interesting because you're on the one hand repairing taste as well as repairing, it's a bit of a, what I'm drawn to here, and I find is very interesting, is the idea of repairing a relationship. It's kind of, because we think so much about repairing an object, certainly in preservation, right? But I think the field of art has brought a kind of understanding of repairing a relationship, and that not all relationships are good. Some are bad, and you need to kind of let go of the bad ones and kind of nurture the good ones. And I love the way in which, you know, as I think about this notion of relationships, that your idea of grafting, you know, just as a treatment for a relationship, you know, is very different than, let's say, talking, or, you know, where we just kind of bounce around an idea back and forth, but you take what you want. But this notion that if you were to graft something of you and me, you know, that would be a different way of repairing a relationship. That would require real commitment, I think.
Yeah.
I'm really drawn to that.
And I think there's definitely you know, this is definitely shared between us, this idea of going back and, you know, mining the 19th century isn't always that, you know, that's not a great, you know, century to mine. But I think art does really become the platform for going back, revisiting, seeing what's useful and valuable moving forward, right? Because it is that time that existed before industrialization. And I think, you know, at least for me, art is at its best when it's doing that, right? To find out what we value, you know, ways of caring for it and ways of sharing that. And I you know, I definitely see an affinity in your work with doing that. So I'm really appreciative of it.
Jorge, I wanted to ask you, and I wanted to ask you both, but Jorge, you come out of a whole other discipline of preservation, conservation, architecture. And so it's a radical move to do what you did. And if you had shown the history of all your work, if we'd had time, and people would have seen all of these projects. So my question really is, by, in a sense, moving over to redefining the work in the art realm is giving you, I think, a lot of permission to use all the techniques and everything that you know and learn from preservation, but to move away from that discipline in any traditional sense of it. So I'm just curious how you thought about it, or where that began, or how that began. And did you get a lot of abuse for it in the beginning? I mean, did preservationists get mad and say, what are you doing? Or you like lost your mind, or, you know?
Yeah, I think I'm still getting some of that abuse, but I don't see it as I'm moving away from preservation. I think that it's a deepening of my commitment to it, but also my commitment to art, in the sense that at a certain point in my career, I realized that, you know, and I think a lot of people get to that point where, you know, you've learned so much and you've kind of, to advance, you need to start making connections across to other disciplines. And then, you know, art was always part of my life, but in a way allowing it to, and I allow myself the metaphor in this context, to blossom, you know, allowing it to blossom was not easy, you know, because of all of the kind of, you know, disciplinary boundaries that you just made. And I remember having conversations with you about this, you know, a long time ago. But in a way, it just became irrelevant at a certain point, you know. And what I've found to be really exciting is the fact that right now there's something very interesting going on, both in preservation and in art. And it has to do with this question of repair, and it has to do with these questions of social and environmental repair. And nobody knows how to do this. And in a way, I think this is the great value of artists. And the 19th century is important here, because, you know, I always go back to remind myself that when people didn't know what the weather was, they didn't know how to predict the weather, they didn't know how to make sense of the weather, they called upon artists, they called upon, you know, landscape painters who actually looked at clouds and who could read the signs on they had the power of observation. And so Fitzpatrick, who's the first to, you know, the captain of the Beagle, you know, that takes Darwin around the world, who then is the first one to start doing forecasting of weather, but he does it thanks to artists. So I think now we're in this moment where we actually really don't know how to repair these relationships, but artists are in this, and I think Sam's work is a really incredible example of it, deepening the relationship also historically. So there is a real, the archival work that Sam has done is beyond the kind of work you see in an ag school. And I know because I went to Cornell, which was one of those land grants, and all they sell is one apple, you know, it's like, so like, this is an amazing contribution, and it's really visionary, and it requires a whole rethinking of the food chain. This is what I find amazing, you know, that it's not just it presents the possibility of a different world. And I think that this is the real role that art can play, is to shape reality, because we know that that's what politics does, but it does it in the end in its own self-interest of politicians. And and they're in the business of acquiring power. And so we can offer a different view of the world. And Sam's asking us to rethink the entire way in which we eat, which is a revolution. I find that amazing.
Sam, when the Department of Defense, what did they want? And what were they worried about? I mean, you say it, but you didn't say what do they want from you? Like, was it a bad thing, or did they want you to teach them something? I'm curious.
I didn't know. I was like, well, I got an email from DARPA, and I was like, this has got to be a prank. People from DARPA don't email you. And so they wanted to brought, there's like 4 artists that they brought down to DC to talk to them about creativity, because their primary concern was that there was not enough creativity in the sciences, right? And they were looking at it at the sort of national level. And then, you know, so we did presentations on our practice, and it was kind of interesting because you're doing presentations to generals sitting in, you know, full military suits. It was very odd. But then they asked me to consider how would you address food security, and I'm like, give money to universities to preserve these varieties. And ultimately the funny thing, and I think this is the sort of interesting part of the relationship, is they said, you know, if you have some technology, you know, we could invest in it. And I'm like, this isn't about technology. This is about taking care of something. And yeah, that's where the sort of relationship fell apart.
But it's also about going back to very old techniques. You know, when people think of technology, they think of new technologies, but you're bringing back technologies. And I think that's the important point, that that's what artists can do, because the motivation is coming from this kind of passion to make something happen and to use anything you can to do that, you know? So they probably just thought you were bizarre because you weren't really making money doing this, and you weren't, you weren't profiting in any literal way.
I don't, that's.
But yet you're obsessed with it, you know? Like, what's that? That's that's a poet's mentality.
Let's not go too deep into that question.
I think you've opened up a really interesting thing, you know, which is this notion of technology, which we struggle with because it is so incredibly dominated at universities by engineering, and, you know, basically by engineering, but also now by bioengineering and so on. And so it also is thought of as this profiting, you know, this kind of entrepreneurial thing that is going to grow and make lots of money and so on. But you're presenting this kind of creative idea about technology, that it can be so much more. That can be a technology of care. This is what I think is, you know, we struggle with this in preservation. And this is, you know, part of my interest in technology, is that what about a technology that is about repairing people's relationship to the world, rather than disrupting people's relationships to the world.
No, and I think you're absolutely right, because we are at a point with the climate that we're not going to be able to develop technology to get ourselves out of it. It's going to take more radical change than that. And it's interesting you were talking about the weather before, because I had worked, I'm also fascinated with the weather in terms of, we think we can control our environment, and the weather is this, it is uncontrollable. We are subject to it. We are changing it right now. And, my family is farmers, and we would put seed in the soil, become dependent on the weather. And our whole existence, every year was like, we're going to lose the farm, right? And I think, like, at a certain point, it's probably from that experience, but at a certain point, you've done everything that you technologically can, and then it becomes like, at the end of technology, it's metaphysics, really. Here,
It's so interesting, because the founder of the preservation program at Columbia, James Marston Fitch, was a weatherman. And
a real weatherman?
Wow.
A real weatherman for the military. He was a military weatherman.
I've got to talk to him.
Well, you can look at his archives. But he was really interested in environmental forces and how they shape the environment, and that's how he got to preservation. And he was one of the first ones to argue for green, what we now call green environmental sustainable architecture, and returning to old technologies as a way to do that. And so, I think the important thing about art is, there's so many important things, but one thing that I think art has done that other disciplines have been unable to do is to maintain open borders. And that is, of course, what everyone thinks is its weakness, but it's for me, its greatest strength, because it is the place where, in the end, once you get to a certain level in your discipline, that is the place where you go is I think art. When you look at neuroscience, the beginning of neuroscience with Ramon y Cajal, who was the first to map the brain, he did these beautiful drawings of the brain, which is the way that he actually was able to communicate to the world what the brain worked, how it worked. And that's through art that he connected to everyone else. So those connections, I think, for a university, and I think here Carol has done tremendous job at Columbia to have those open borders be an ethos for the university, which has kind of siloed itself into these differing departments that never talk to one another.
Yeah.
So that's why I really appreciate you inviting me, Carol, to speak at your school, because this is just what a university should be.
Well, I always think that some of the most interesting people working in the arts today are people who start with an idea and an obsession, and then are willing to go anywhere they need to go to actualize that idea. So they're not obsessed with form so much as they're obsessed with, how do I show or manifest this thought, and how do I take this thought to its farthest and most logical conclusion. And to do that, there needs to be fluidity of form, But Jorge, and Sam, and Gavin, because you're all in universities with me, in different ones, but we're all in universities. It's very difficult to communicate what it is that artists bring that is completely unique into these academic institutions. And it's very difficult when people study the work that artists do to have people understand that without art, there are no art historians. Without writers, there is no English department. Without, it's really difficult to say, as I used to say at the Art Institute, where we had a school and a museum, to the trustees of the museum, without artists, there are none of these objects. But it's really difficult for people to value this complex process that we're talking about. and to understand that that's how you get to really new things, and not new things because they've never been in the world, but maybe they were in the world and now they're being brought back for a whole new function at a time. So the tree is at a time when we don't have, fruit has become, as we were talking about earlier, we don't have flavorful fruit anymore in America. Like, how'd that happen? What happened to the peach? You could spend your life trying to figure out. Well, you are spending your life. What happened to the peach? But Jorge, you'd think that we would have learned everything there is to know about the effects of pollution on everything, and yet, as we talked about another time, you go to Beijing and it's dark all day, can be like 19th century cities in America that couldn't see daylight because there was so much pollution. And you can be in Beijing when it's like that. And you can have days when no one goes out. So we're such an interestingly complicated species that we don't learn. And so here are both of you kind of invested in these projects, putting it in front of people and saying, here's this complicated, symbolic, metaphoric, and very practical thing that I'm offering to you.
Yeah. And I think it's, one of the things that I keep coming back, these are complex problems, these are intertwined, intersectional problems, right? That people can throw their hands up and go, well, how are we going to get rid of coal? Because we're still burning a ton of it. But I always come back to this idea, and we touched upon it, of technology being separated from culture. I think that's one of our big problems, right? We think of technology as its own thing. But when I think of a cigarette as a nicotine delivering technology, how did we get off smoking cigarettes? In very short time. It wasn't because of the nicotine patch. That was the technology that was going to solve everything. It was because we had a cultural revolution, of the best kind, of people, making art, some of it propaganda art, but other, really fundamental, followed by good policy. Mm-hmm. And it started in New York in many ways. Bloomberg banned smoking and everyone thought it was going to kill the economy. Well, lo and behold, it didn't, right? And so we need to lead with culture as well, but the policymakers need to be behind. And so I think I think artists are doing a lot of heavy lifting to move culture and to offer alternatives. Of course, we can eat 40 different kinds of pit fruit. Why not? We just have to accept the fact that they're not all going to look the same. Some of them is going to be ugly. Some of them is not going to be right. We're going to have to learn to pick the good fruit as we did. And that has to be followed with policy, fund that kind of agriculture. Don't just fund the big agriculture corporations. We can do it. It just, but for this, artists need to have a seat at the table. And this is why I've always made the case for artists to be at the table. And it's very, very hard because people are taught from the day they're kids that they need to stop being artists because it's a fool's errand to draw or to paint, and you're going to be poor, and that's not true. So we are teaching all our children not to be artists when in fact this is where we need that cultural movement through art to be able to go hand in hand with technology and policy.
What we need is the bravery of artists. We need the courage to follow a train of thought to its end point, however wild it may seem, and however much other people may reject it. Gavin, do you want to jump in here? And are you also looking at the questions?
I wanted to just talk about the context in which these works are presented, Governor's Island and Lyndhurst. And they were both commissioned by nonprofit organizations, the Trust for Governor's Island and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And I was just wondering, what did those associations give you as artists, and that maybe an art museum may not necessarily?
Sam, you want to go first?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm just like over the moon about being able to present the project at Governor's Island. It's, you know, they have so many projects that are related to climate change. And I really think it's a place where they're using, as a nonprofit, they're using, you know, this nonprofit structure to actually try to take on climate change. And it's truly extraordinary. And it's wonderful to be a part of it. You know, I mean, this is in addition to being so generous in terms of, you know, I traveled around New York for 3 or 4 years, like looking for some place to plant an orchard, you know. So in addition to saying to me, yeah, here's an acre of land, you know, do what you want. It's also accompanied by a lot of like-minded thinkers. And I think that that's the real, for me, it's being able to work with really amazing people who are like-minded in that pursuit.
I think that I work a lot with nonprofits. It ends up, I think that you know, museums, I've worked with a lot of museums as well. I mean, I did, you know, works at ephemeral works in museums, the works are in museum collections. But I think museums approach their role as kind of structures of protecting art. You know, they're in the business of kind of conserving it, making sure it doesn't, you know, people don't touch it, you know. So they approach art as something that is vulnerable and weak and unable to do what it needs to do on its own, and requires all of this para-structural framework in order to deliver, right? It needs the curator to put the text. It needs the institution to buy the art. By the way, the artist doesn't get any of that. It needs all these things to kind of hold the art together. So it portrays art as something dependent on this larger structure. And if you don't have this institutions and museums and so on, you're not going to have art. I think that's a very antiquated view of art. And art, certainly in the work of Sam, certainly in mine, art takes on the role of saving, you know, of care. It is the means and the method through which you care for the world. And it is quite powerful at doing that. It is not dependent on these outside structures. And so it operates in parallel to the museum. I mean, I'm not sure I would call it institutional, you know. I mean, I think that Sam's work is collected by museums and so on, but I think it sits in the museum very differently. Certainly, I mean, Sam's work sits outside the museum, literally. So I think that's very important too. And I don't think museums have, you know, foundations are much more nimble, and they're interested in the work itself, not how the work kind of sits in their collection, or how it fits into a larger pattern, or how they can collect it, or how, you know, they don't ask themselves all these questions. I mean, one of the ridiculous experiences I had was doing the work I did an installation at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And at the end, the curator wanted to collect the piece, but was told by the top brass that the Victoria and Albert Museum doesn't collect contemporary. And so they, you know, what does that mean? So I think the nature of art has changed. Contemporary art in the last decade is so different that foundations are leading the way in doing that. I think, for example, Art Angel has been doing this work in London. I was very fortunate to be commissioned an artwork from them. And it was about what Carol was talking about, the bravery. And I would say it wasn't just the bravery of the artist, although, I'd like to think that there was some there, but the work wouldn't have happened without these foundations. And Art Angel really co-created the work in the sense that they had the bravery to commission a work like that, which, entailed displaying the pollution of Parliament in Parliament in the UK. That's not an easy thing to do, and it took like 6 years to get it done. And so we need more of those foundations, but they're few and far between. And I always think when I go travel the world, there are not that many foundations for art that are as generous to artists as there are, let's say, New York or London or even Paris. You go to other places and they just don't exist.
Gavin, did you want to follow up with something?
Yeah, I could maybe I'll take a few questions from the audience. A couple of people, Sam, are familiar with Michelin star chefs who might like to work with you, so I could connect you.
Oh gosh, yes, please.
Someone would like to hear if you'll be bringing back a tart form of apples, T-A-R-T.
Oh gosh. Okay, yeah, I'm going through these.
And kind of might be interesting to hear a little bit about, I just would personally be interested in hearing a little bit about programming. I know, Sam, that the workshops that you've had are sort of part of the project, and you'll be planting these in community gardens. It might be interesting to hear about the programming. And then following up on that, Jorge, Robin Lynn notes that it has just been announced that the Westminster Dog Show will take place at the Lyndhurst Estates in June 2021. What role could the pool house play? Robin asked because Jorge's presentation and our work are so theoretical and the dog show is not.
Sam, do you want to go ahead?
Okay.
The relationship between the canine.
I'm sorry, I got lost. What am I talking about? I got lost in the dog show. I'm sorry. Gavin.
Sorry, I told you, I asked you many questions.
Programming. Okay.
About programming.
So yeah, the past, I guess since January, we've been doing workshops, partnering with Governor's Island and Green Thumb, part of New York City Parks. And we've been sort of going through a year of the trees. So we started off pruning. There's nothing like getting 150 people to attend a workshop on pest control, but it was like, that one was a hot one, yeah, obviously we were doing grafting, and yeah, with the pandemic, we started off doing them in person and then shifted online, which actually has turned out to be pretty great because we'll do them during lunchtime. So we'll get people that tune in for lunch. And actually our next one is tree planting. That's next Tuesday, I believe. Yeah. And so those are the types of things that, yeah, so eventually we'll get to the point where everybody's, we can invite people out to the island and do everything in person. And we were able to do a few grafting workshops last summer. But yeah, that's,
will you do, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Will you also program, will there be programming in community gardens once the trees are eventually planted there as well?
Yeah, yeah. And I've started to do some, obviously it's virtual right now, but yeah, there's community gardens that they've just reached out, like, what should I do with this tree? So, and it's kind of nice because the project, obviously it's centered on Governor's Island, but somehow I worked my way into a public art project that's across the 5 boroughs now. And I was like, wow, this has got much more expansive than I had anticipated going into it.
Yeah.
So
but I think it tells you something, Sam. It tells you how hungry people are to be part of nature and to be in any way, shape, or form part of the repairing of the planet or the earth. I think most people, I mean, this is the big issue. I know the climate scientists talk about it all the time. Their biggest issue is communicating to people ways that they can not just understand what's happening, but in some way participate without it feeling so extreme that people get terrified, you know, which means you have to give up your car, you have to give up your lifestyle, you have to give, you know, that's so big that people get scared. But I think everyone, so many people, especially young people, are so attuned to wanting to be part of, they know we've screwed us up, and their younger generations really understand it, and they're in pain about it because it's their world that they're inheriting. And so anything that people can do which makes them feel they're growing things and nurturing things and in the earth and touching it, I think that's all wonderful right now. And I think you're going to be amazed at the response on Governor's Island if we ever get to all be together again. But if we do, and when we do, I think you'll be amazed at how interested people will be. That's what I think.
And I think it's I mean, the terrifying thing that New York is looking at right now is the climate becoming subtropic, right? Like it really is, with weather patterns. If they continue like this over the next couple of years, New York becomes subtropic. I mean, we're almost at the point where you could consider growing citrus there. Like how, I don't even know what, I don't even know how to wrap my head around that, but I think it's also, I think it's just, if you grow a tomato plant, grow anything, and to me that always, if you know how hard you have to work to get a tomato,
I do know.
That makes you think about everything.
And we got a tomato, so I do know.
And usually, like with if you're growing tomatoes at home, it's usually like a $50 investment to get a tomato. It's like this huge epic adventure. But I think it also teaches you value of these things, right? It's you value your food a lot more because
I'm excited
of that.
about our tomato. I mean, it was thrilling, but Jorge, I want to ask you something before we run out of time, and it's a question, Gavin, you want to ask about actually interpretation and how much information.
Yes, yeah.
Why don't you ask it?
Sure. Well, actually, it's sort of applicable to both Jorge and Sam, but I was interested that Jorge, that you stated specifically that you did not want to have interpretation signage. And Sam, I think I've read in interviews with you that you also sort of like this idea of people chancing upon the tree. So maybe it's just an interesting decision. I wondered if you wanted to talk about that more. Why do you?
Well, I would, I think for me, it was kind of conceptually important to allow people to bring to the work their own perceptions and to wonder where the work ends, both in terms of physical space and in terms of time. They go in and out of the sounds of water. Do they repeat themselves? Is it just, one sound? They bring themselves out of the space, into the space. And so the frame, this work is a dialogue with Cole, Thomas Cole, and landscape painting, which is one way of understanding the environment. But the trick there was you put a very big thing into a small thing, a painting. So that idea depends on the frame. And I was very interested in how do I get something gigantic, massive, let's say even sublime inside of a space without a frame. And interpretation is a frame. Interpretation is the thing that says, okay, now you're looking at a work of art, pay attention, which is of course when people stop paying attention, right? Because they're like, oh, I got the label, so I'm gone. They don't look at the work because the labels are horrible. The labels just say, there should be a whole class on label writing. The labels just say the name of the artist, the dimensions of the work. They should say, take a look at this part of the work. They should make people look back at the work. So I just was not, that's why I left that picture, because that picture makes you look back at the pool again. But I feel that interpretation sometimes gets in the way of people's experience and understanding of art, and it's intimidating. It's intimidating because it presupposes, I mean, everything that I said about the work today is not there when you go
Right.
there. It's not, it doesn't matter, actually. You know, it's my own, it's what I bring to the work. But other people bring something else. And I wanted to give that equal primacy. If there had been a label, then there would be a very long label at the front of the building talking about Thomas Cole and this and landscape painting and so on, and the people's eyes would glaze over.
Well, what's interesting at the Lyndhurst estate and the watershed piece is it's a puzzle. Like when you walk in, you start, okay, oh, that latex wall is that wall, and in that little room, these are the pieces of things that were left over from the pool, and you have to decipher it yourself, and then the sounds appears, and that's really dramatic. So it works. It actually really works, but you have to spend time with it. You have to go into it and spend time with it. You know,
spend a moment.
Well, spend enough time so that in a way what you're doing as the visitor is you're reconstructing your thought process, but people don't realize that's what they're doing. And then you left that little picture that you showed of the pool when it was in its best moment, and you think, oh, okay, and it's just a little clipping from a newspaper on a wall that you could miss it, and you say, oh, that was that pool. Oh my God, and they had a little boat. This is really amazing. Anyway, you know.
Yeah.
So anything else? We have only a few more minutes. Anybody else? Anything else before we leave each other from the cyber universe and go back to our own universes?
Just a comment, I would say that I love the magical wands, and I think that I would love to have one.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if I can,
Oh, no, we can definitely work something out. That's an interesting story because I had the eclipse, I think it was 2017. It wasn't going to pass over Syracuse where I live. So I had a friend of mine go out into his orchard in Oregon, collect the branches, overnight them to me, and then salted them and did the whole process. It was like really elaborate, but I mean, if I followed everything correctly, they seem to be working. So
yes,
I'm still here. So they're,
You said something about, I have a friend who studies medicinal plants, and she lives in Belize. And every time they come into Belize to do a big development of some sort, she goes before they do that, and she collects all the medicinal plants in the wildness, because they're becoming so exactly what you're talking about. They're disappearing because people are building so much that those open sort of jungle fields of where all these plants exist are being destroyed. So she goes and to harvest them all so she can plant them on her land. So it reminded me very much of what you were talking about, that you have to conserve these because they're gone. Development will just destroy them all, which is why the project on Governor's Island is so thrilling, that we'll get to see it, because it will give people a chance to see this rehabilitation of something, this repairing, this restoration. You know. Well, I thank you both so much. Thank you, Gavin. Thank you, Jesse, for running the webinar, and we appreciate everybody and everything. And thank you to the the viewers who tuned in to listen to us. And
it was a pleasure.
Yeah, everybody be well. Take care.
All right, thank you.
Bye.